We'll wait just a few more moments for people to join. One of the things that we've been trying to do on these calls, on each one of them, is feature an organization that's helping people that have little or no safety net. And we wanted to try something different today and just invite you, if you have groups that you think and know of that are doing quality work and supporting that, just to put it in the chat. It's been great to see in the chat all the nations where people are, but we also can use the chat to sort of figure out which organizations we can support that don't have the safety net that we have here. So just invite you to do that. We'll continue to share and feature them. But if you have organizations that are lifting others up who need that love and support, we'd love to know about them.
Hi, everyone.
Morning, afternoon.
Afternoon here in London.
Yes.
Hi, everyone.
I see a Bostoner.
So we'll get started maybe in another minute or so. Again, we're going to use the same format. Just do some grounding, share some content, and then share some time together. And invite anyone who wants to stay for the last sort of half hour of Q&A, which has been quite fruitful from people's response. And we've gotten through most of the questions. And again, for those of you who are just joining, we just invite you in the chat to name groups that are doing extraordinary or needed work for those who have less of a safety net. So just to use that there as well. And thanks for sharing where you're coming from. So in a moment, I'm going to invite Morley to help us ground again. But I just want to start again with just a blessing for each of you and your health and your families and your loved ones' health. And also just a prayer that the lessons we're all learning come as gently as possible. And with that, Morley, I'd love to ask you again to help us ground with your combination of spirit, crafts, skill as an activist, artist, and everything that you are. So Morley, I turn it over to you to help us ground for a few moments.
Thank you, Zander. Hello, everybody. Let's bring our hands together and rub them and bring our energy into our hands. And scoot forward on your seat if you're sitting in a chair with your feet flat on the floor. If you're sitting cross-legged or lying down, all the better, all good. Just create some space in the spine, relaxing your shoulders, bringing some heat to our hands, and feeling the warmth, generating warmth. Notice if you're holding your breath, and notice if you're breathing nice and easy. Let's bring the awareness of the breath through the nose and slow the hands down and gently open them just a little bit so you can feel that energy between the palms, and slowly bring them back towards each other. Very simple way of connecting with this energy and life force and gentleness. And now let's place the right hand on the belly and the left hand on the heart. And we'll do about 4 minutes of breathing. You're going to inhale into the belly, into the ribs and chest. And exhaling, the belly softens, the ribs and chest soften. This is recreating our breathing while we're sleeping. So inhale, belly rises, ribs and chest expand. Beautiful, everyone. Exhale, belly softens, ribs and chest soften. Inhale, belly rises, chest expands. Exhale, soft belly and soft heart. Inhale, belly rises, chest expands. Exhale, belly softens, chest softens. Again, inhale, expand, expand, expand. Exhale, soft belly, soft heart. Inhale, belly rises, ribs and back and chest expand. Exhale, shoulders are water, soft belly, soft heart. Relax the jaw and tongue, eyes. Inhale, belly rises, chest expands, beautiful. Exhale, soft belly, soft heart. And continue this breathing for 4 more breaths, feeling the power of our togetherness, feeling the connection to the breath of life. As you're breathing, feel the gentleness of the air just beneath your nostrils. Gentle air just above your lip, under your nostrils. Sky above us, earth below us, all love and possibility around us. And slowly wiggle your fingers and maybe wiggle your toes and bring your hands together, your palms together one more time and rub them. Taking a nice breath into the back, feeling that space between the shoulder blades. Exhale, shoulders are water, nice and soft. Maybe move the head around. And just bring the warm palms wherever you need them, over your eyes or by your ears, back of your neck, wherever you need it. Just give yourself a nice rub, nice squeeze. And Zander asked me to offer a little song. I'd sing one line of this beautiful Lakota song, translated into English. When I see you, I see beauty. I see you, I see me. We are one. Have a beautiful gathering today. A beautiful day.
Thank you, Morley. Thank you for that grounding. And just thank you, everyone. This group has been real grounding for me and for each other. And it's just been a pleasure to ground in this way. I think we had people from over 26 countries yesterday. And that's just delicious in the sea of everything else we're facing and connecting to. And just acknowledge Morley and Judith and others, artists who are on here who, there's an old quote that I was touched by when I was young, that if life made sense, we wouldn't need art. And how artists are the antidote to us figuring out some of what's going on. So just appreciative for all of you in that space. And so thank you. So again, part of what we're going to do today is go into some other content. Again, really encourage you to use the chat to share groups that are doing some amazing work for those with less of a safety net, and just to dive in there. part of what we're trying to do in this process is continue to help us have the skills and tools to metabolize, digest, and process what's happening in these adaptive times. And so I want to keep walking through ideas. As a gentle reminder, as we're trying to do every day, we're all going through this collective adaptive experience, which we were not prepared for. We're not prepared for adaptive work. We're not prepared to jump into involuntary change. And so we're figuring it out and figuring it out together. And as I've tried to say every day, being an adult or adulting is not suffering privately, but it's being able to digest what is happening and getting the help you need. And so just want to thank those who have actually practiced asking for help from us, from others, and this skill set of figuring out how to get your needs met in a healthy way is really important now more than ever. And then part of what we're trying to do in this series is figure out how do we build the adaptive capacity to be equipped for what's happening today and to be equipped for what's happening in the future. Part of the way we frame this is understanding that adaptation is choosing what is sort of in the past, what to bring forward, what to leave behind, as I just said, and what to create and grow. In my sort of 10-block walk over here, as I mentioned yesterday, you have the evidence that people are doing a lot of work to clean out their closets. I think maybe even more than some of their feelings. And to those who asked me yesterday, I did sanitize this rotary phone toy that I had brought up. So it was sanitized. And just for one moment of levity, today when I was walking over, this was what I saw. This is what someone was getting rid of. And if you look at the assortment of records here, the part of adaptation is getting rid of the right things and not the wrong things. Getting rid of a Bob Dylan album today makes little or no sense to me. Getting rid of Disco Hustle, we might need that. Kiss, Love Gun, you might understand that. If you think about the lyrics that are on these records, the times they are changing, as the present now will later be past, the order is rapidly fading. That's a lyric in an album I've listened to multiple times. Those of you who know me know that music is medicine, and I've been self-medicating and prescribing for years. It's also hilarious that when I look at the Kiss album, Let's Get Together, We Can Get Hot, all the references to what used to be sexy music, all the hot references now make me think of kind of Corona fever. And there's such different associations to some of this. But as we kind of continue and we think about what part of the skill set, what does it mean to be equipped for the future? We spent Monday talking about adaptive change, some of the tools and practices of that. We talked yesterday about scenario planning and sort of the methods for understanding and mapping out what are the different futures that lie ahead of us. And today we're going to spend some time talking about productive disequilibrium and sort of how do we live in this state. I wrote an HB article called Living Leadership in a Permanent Crisis 10 years ago almost now, that now seems more relevant than ever. But how do we exist in this state of disequilibrium, and how do we sort of grow and live through it? We're going to spend some time tomorrow in a sort of a little bit more of a personal frame, talking about how do we protect ourselves? How do we remain safe in these times? And then we're going to sort of culminate at the end of this week with a very deliberate session on decision-making and how do we master life choices. In adaptation, we're not interested only in how do you equip yourself, but actually, what do you do with it? What do you equip yourself for? Leadership for what? Adaptation for what? So we're going to end this course of the week looking at that. One of the things that's been very helpful is to get people's feedback on what's happening and what that works. We just ask you to do more of that. We've added 2 sessions for next week. We're going to continue the series on Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesday, we're going to do a very focused session on what do we need to let go of to move forward. Most of us are dealing with pieces that we have to let go of. And so how do we do that with some dignity, grace, ritual, so that we can actually step forward into what's happening? Thursday, we're still collecting your notes about what you want us to do. We have some 75 modules of different content. We're trying to figure out what's most relevant at this time. But we really are eager and been very welcoming to your feedback of what you want and need from us. And so if you have thoughts about, if you want more sessions like this, more in-depth workshops, a bunch of people said they wanted to spend time going into scenario planning in workshop form. If they want to do a more cohort-based thing. So just if you could give us some of that feedback, we kind of welcome all of it. As we sort of said each day, each of us are in this kind of sense-making process, and just continuing to invite you to ask you where you are in sort of searching and discovery or meaning-making, where you are and kind of making some tough choices. How do you land and where do you land in that? And so just the point here is that we want to get to real decisions and driving that forward. And so that's where we're kind of headed. We got some background noise. I'm going to try and mute that for us for temporarily. You can all unmute yourself later. And we'll continue from there. Okay, I am not a tech wizard. So here we go. Let's continue here. So today what we're trying to focus on to dive into the content is kind of productive disequilibrium, a nerdy term that will make more sense as we get into it. What we know in kind of doing this work is that in this COVID crisis and dealing with adaptive change, it will take some time, and it is causing disequilibrium in lots of different ways. And so part of what we want to figure out is how do we equip ourselves, how do we equip our families, our teammates, our businesses to live and grow through this. As you think about the ideas we're going to lay out in this sessions, invite you to think about whatever frame makes sense for you. Is it where you stand inside yourself? Is it where you stand with your team, with your loved ones, with your children, with your aging parents, with your organization? Because all of us are going through some level of this productive, hopefully, space of disequilibrium, but it's here. And what we know as human beings, as creatures, that there is a limit of tolerance that we each have. That limit of tolerance is very real and very different for each of us. One of the things that we're trying to do in organizations and in our families is understand what is that limit of tolerance that different people have. How do we expand what that limit of tolerance is? And if we're leading others or making decisions for them, or if we're trying to hold ourselves through this process, we want to start to understand what is our relationship to disequilibrium, but what is this upper threshold of kind of limit of tolerance? And as we know, this limit of tolerance is moving all the time. It's moving literally in moments in a conversation where we're sort of stepping out of our comfort zone, or some feedback or hard thing to hear is said. It's happening in society when we go through a crisis, when we go through a traumatic experience, when we go through beauty and awe. All of these things are constantly changing where this limit of tolerance is. And as we think about what sets our sort of place for this limit of tolerance, there are obviously internal and external factors. There's factors and conditions that live inside of us, and there's external factors that we're acting upon, or acting upon us. And not that this is an exhaustive list, but we should start to look at those. If we wanted to understand what is setting my limit of tolerance, we want to think about what's our history. I'm a big nerd about this stuff, so I have spent time walking through every moment of my life where I learned where I could tolerate things and where I couldn't. Where did ideas kind of affect me and land with me where I feel alive, or what ideas land in my mind or in my team's mind that help us constrain and get smaller? Physically, our bodies are receptors all the time of where we feel safe or not. Where do I feel safe? How is my limit of tolerance quite different based on my white man architecture versus others? Where does that all get set? How does that live inside of me? My emotions. What emotions are safe? What emotions are not safe? There's an old saying that when we grow up in families where you can have happiness, sadness, or anger, but nobody grows up with all three. In my family, we were allowed to be happy and we were allowed to feel sad, but anger was kind of off limits because of the history of abuse that had sort of occurred in my family in past generations and what existed there. And so inside of us is all of this internal wiring about where we learn how to be. There's a way in which in every relationship we're training each other about where we can be relationally with this limit of tolerance. How far can we step before we get pushback or something happens? And I want us to all think about these internal factors again, not just for ourselves, but for everyone we love and work with. If we're all going to survive and adapt through this, how do we understand and begin to build on that history so that we can build our limit of tolerance for what we may be going through together? So it's a lens to look at yourself, but it's also a lens to look at others. And as we kind of started to talk about a bit, there's a lot of external factors, right, that determine sort of what our limit of tolerance is. What is the environment for failure? What is the environment of support? What is the environment of oppression? What is the environment of what our friends are, right? There's an old saying, right, that if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. You can think about that across every dimension of being alive. If you're the most emotional person, you're the most creative, you're the most spiritual. But where is the community of people we have, not just of friends, but in our workforce, saying this is the set of behaviors we tolerate, and this is the ones that go beyond. And we think in this beautiful way, and especially in this Western mind that I've been culturated to, that we are the agents of everything that happens to us. And yet at the same time, we are so culturated by what happens around us. How are climates of fear, of opportunity, of bliss shaping my own sense of tolerance, my own organizations? Where has my team felt that they can push and say hard things? Where do those things happen in the hallways and outside of the sort of honest conversation? What happened in my family when I had a racist uncle at Thanksgiving? How did I learn how to behave, right? So again, we can think about this as a family system, as a personal system, but also as an organization. What has been tolerated and allowed to exist there? What we know in kind of the biological piece, and some of you know this well, but I'll go through it quickly, is that when we reach this limit of tolerance, we go through a physical, biological piece. And if this is our kind of spinal cord and this is our brain, at the top of that, which is highlighted in red here, is this kind of almond-shaped piece that's sometimes called the reptilian brain. That part of the brain is one of the oldest parts of our brain that acts faster than everything else. It's asking at a speed faster than any feeling, creative neocortex. Am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? All the time. And what happens that we know in brain science is that when that gets triggered, the rest of our neocortex doesn't function the same way. We know there's about 7 seconds where that almond-shaped hormones gets released into our system, and there's that immediate flood, right, that happens. Sometimes we want people to bounce back right away, but it doesn't work that way. Some brain science says it takes 30 minutes. Other brain science says it takes 3 hours to get back to normal functioning, but it doesn't happen right away. And what's really interesting as humans is we get triggered into that hijack, whether the threat is real or perceived. If we've gone through a lifetime where we've been slapped down for offering up a part of ourselves or a controversial idea, we'll see that even the slightest possibility of that happens. And again, part of why I want you to think about this is not just for yourself. How is the amygdala hijack? How is the brain happening in my children at the moment who are on top of each other? To my parents who are isolated and removed from everything that helps them feel safe. To my coworkers who are coming into work feeling somewhat maybe safe in them, but knowing 3 or 4 of their friends or spouses or siblings just lost their job, or a family member has early symptoms. All of these things can trigger us into this kind of state. And so we want to be aware of what that is. The good thing to know, which is helpful for some of us who have easy access to our emotions and tears, is that crying and laughter are 2 things that help balance our brain and our system. And so it's helpful to have some of those and access to those. My children are sometimes have to deal with my terrible jokes, but sometimes it helps all of us to kind of walk through those. Just to continue on, what happens when this amygdala hijack occurs is that we get into what's called the fight, flight, or freeze response. And what's interesting, because we have people here from so many cultures and different places, is that these look different in every context. And what's really interesting to me is fight, whatever form of fighting that looks like occurs. What's interesting is flight, of how people run away. But having done this work for over 20 years now, when I started doing it, there was kind of an even distribution between those three, where people would be triggered into one of those states. And there's just been this steady escalation in my experience that people are more and more freezing, that people are more and more going numb. And there's a very different consequence when people in their process go numb rather than do one of those other two things. And part of what we see in this COVID crisis is lots of ways that people are numbing themselves. I would say equally so, we could start to point to all the ways that people were numbing themselves before to the reality of what we might face and what was going on. And so when we're working with ourselves and we're working with other people to bring through change, we not just want to understand what is a limit of tolerance, we want to get disciplined in understanding which of these ways do they sort of react and how do people numb themselves. And as people numb themselves, there's a whole bunch of kind of micro behaviors that people go to. On your screen now is a list of some of them. It would be interesting to think about which is your favorite, or which are ones that other people go to. And some of these have different kinds of level of consequence, do different levels of harm to our ability to be present to life, to engage with life. And what's very interesting is that some of these, on the other side of them, have people who are actively trying to get you engaged and numbing. There's a debate I have with friends that who also have children that isn't the way my children sort of want to use the internet and social media equivalent to how I used to talk on the phone or try to talk on the phone to friends. And the difference being, when I was talking on the phone to friends, there wasn't 300 engineers on the other side tracking how to get us to be acclimatized and stuck in that space. So the numbing activities now are different than they were, and we all numb. I don't want to say that all numbing is bad. Sometimes we do have to escape the size and scale of what's happening to us and catch a breath. But there's a difference between rejuvenation and numbing. There's a difference between escaping and relaxation and numbing. And so I just want to start to watch for, when I work with people, what is their go-to form of figuring out what is their numbing from, and what would it take to equip them to face those things. And so just to think about that as we move forward in this. What we also know, kind of when we sort of have this limit of tolerance, is that without some disequilibrium, nothing changes. Now, below some state of disequilibrium, nothing changes. And so we kind of remain under there in a status quo. Many of us before COVID were very much in that space, right, for a long period of time. And so what happens now is we have this interesting space where it's above some level of change, where we actually change can happen and occur, and below a limit of tolerance where things blow up or become dysfunctional. And what we want to think about for ourselves in leadership and change and family life is, how do we manage, produce, curate, or hold ourselves in that middle space? How do we not get stuck in the status quo? Not to say the status quo is wrong. Some of the traditional things that we've done will fit there. That's God's work too, but it needs to happen. What we also know is this change zone, is this space where change is possible, is not just the space of change, but it's where creativity happens. It's where artists and others engage in their work. It's where trust gets formed. It's where innovation happens. It's where new connections, right? Anyone who wants to renew their marriage or love life can find it in this zone more likely than in status quo. How does growth and entrepreneurship, the testing of ideas and truth, happen? What does it look like here in a way that engages us, in a way that allows us to experience more love and life? But this is also the zone where trade-offs happen and choices happen. And so part of what we want to think about is, how can we live in this zone together? How do we create spaces for ourselves and each other? How do we create companies and teams where we can be in the zone for longer, more often, on the most important things? But what happens is that this change zone is very different depending on whether this is your version of change zone where what you're doing in status quo is low, where you have a higher limit of tolerance. What's possible in this change zone is very different than this one. And for many people we work with, they're spending 90% of their time, right, in status quo and trying to dance a little bit in change. We see that now. We see that sort of what was the cost of that. For other people, this is what their change zone might look like. That the world and experience is so triggering because the world has been traumatic for them, that the world has not been a safe place for them to explore in disequilibrium, right? Right? That there's a lower threshold of change, but there's a very low ceiling of tolerance. And so what happens is we think about ourselves, we think about our family members, if we think about our elected officials, right, who have to help guide us through this. If we think about you as decision makers and the decisions you make have consequence on other people's lives, life gets very different depending on which zone we're in and how do we engage and live there. How do we live there together? How do we drop into stuff we know how to do in the gray zone, but rise up into that change zone? How do we change the platform of which we stand on and where the ceiling is? And many people are discovering, there's hopefully a little bit of a progression here, that 90% of their life before was status quo momentum, defaults, living out the same reality every day. Then there's a shock to the system where much of that reality goes away and everything is threatening. And when everything is threatening and we're in crisis, then we tend to get smaller and default. And so part of what we want to think about is how do we begin to expand the zone for ourselves and for each other? So because of two reasons. One, that's the zone where possibility and creativity and all of this generating a future can happen. But it's also the zone where we're actually going to make the tough decisions and trade-offs for what's coming at us. And again, I want you to think about this, not just for yourself, but everyone in your life that you are taking care of or how to think about. How do we understand with new eyes that someone may be walking in today with a different experience that happened last night or in their family or on the news that's shrinking or changing that zone? Now, as we know that this is a zone we want to live in together more and more, we also know in our language, and Jeff and others who help lead adaptive leadership and technical work, that technical work is stuff we know how to do. Kind of maybe there's a little bump in the road, but in a short amount of time, we can fix it. And we love those things. Adaptive work has a very different footprint. And when I used to do this, I used to say, well, you know, adaptive work is the adaptive work that shouldn't be your lifestyle because it's so freaking exhausting. But for many of us in the last few weeks, we've been living that green line, even with more volatility than here, not just in the space of the adaptive work, because so much of our life has been adaptive. And it's wonderful to see how we're adapting to Zoom, how we're adapting to getting our families food and figuring out pieces so that we're moving some of what this green line was down to the blue line of what we can adapt and figure out. But life may look more like this green line than the blue one for a while. And so again, we're asking this question of how do we create space and equip ourselves to live in this productive disequilibrium kind of over time. One of the things that's worth noting is that one of the greatest human skill sets ever created is the ability to avoid the tough choices in that change zone. We call it work avoidance. We think about that both as organizations, right? You all know in the organizations you live and work in all the ways they've avoided making a tough decision. Form a task force, right? With no authority, right? We need more data. We tried that before. It's not ready yet. That's not my problem. Right? And the same way you can do that, you can understand for yourself the way you do it yourself. One of the ways I do it is I keep myself so busy that I never have to look at some of the hard stuff. I take care of everybody else so I don't have to look at some of my own work. We all have our own ways that are dressed up in noble terms sometimes to avoid the work that's in front of us. And again, part of what we want to do and this beautiful need we have to be adaptive, to live in disequilibrium over time, is to figure out how we stop that work avoidance and come back into that space, knowing that that's the space of choice making and those things. And so part of the invitation is we're going to shift in a moment to the small groups is what can we do together to expand that zone to face what we need to face, to design and artistically curate what has to happen, and to also create the space for others to operate in that. I desperately want my elected officials to not have that other version where there's just a narrow, low band, where the limit of tolerance is so low. What do we do that sets the conditions for others to expand into that space? Knowing at the same time, that's an absolutely unreasonable request when we are in a real crisis, when people's jobs and stability and food and all of that is also on the line. So there's a way in which we engage in this as a dialogic act between the people we're working with and ourselves, between the conditions that are happening around us and the conditions that are happening inside of us. And so part of what we believe in doing this work, and especially in this moment, is that this is a critical space to live in for adaptation always, but more in this moment, this will likely be more of what our reality is for the next period of time. So I want to invite you to we're going to move into the small groups in a moment, as we have every day. And I just want to ask you a little bit more pointed questions than we are the other day. First of all, if you just want to be there and share honestly where you are, and that's the human need you have, just share where you are. But if we can start to understand where is our zone now, and what can we do for ourselves and others to start to expand it, so we can be more present to life and what's happening, I think it would be helpful. So again, we're going to move into small groups. I'm going to try and figure out how to do this once again, and we will get us there. And again, invite you to think about how to do that in a way that honors where you are now and what you are needing kind of moving forward. So here we go. I'm going to put you in a small groups. We'll do it again for about 25 minutes. We'll come back and hear from a few people, and then we'll spend the last half hour in Q&A as we have the other days. It should pop up onto your screen now, and then please click on that so you can move, and we'll see you in about 25 minutes. Thank you. You should see a little thing pop up on your screen to move to your rooms. Let us know if you don't see that. It should pop up. There should be rooms about 5 people each. Everyone should be assigned to a room. Looks like there's about 24 of you who haven't flipped over yet. Anybody need any help moving? You should have a little
Zander,
screen. Hi.
How you doing? Sorry, I had to step off for a minute.
No
so
problem.
should I join the breakout room?
Yeah, why don't you join the breakout room? Feel free to participate and listen in. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, man. Hope you're doing great.
Okay. Yeah, family's good. Okay, we'll see you in a little bit.
Here. All right.
Okay. Hop over. Coy, I'm gonna go stay hydrated. Can you move anybody over? Do you need me to come back and do that?
Unfortunately, only you can do it, but I will track and see if anybody needs a hand, and then I'll give you a shout.
Okay, sounds good. Please click over to your small groups. We'll come back in about 20 minutes or so. Thank you. We're going to come back from the small groups in 4 minutes, about 4 minutes. Coming back from the small groups in 2 minutes. Hi, Crystal.
Hey, Zander. I got a quick question for you while we regather.
Okay.
The other day you said that you had opened a retreat house.
Mhm.
Where is it? And
In
you
Brooklyn.
rent it out?
Yeah.
Ah, we got to talk.
Okay. Sounds good. Good.
Planning a retreat has been on my bucket list for about 3 years now.
Okay. Well, let's talk about it. Happy to share.
All right, awesome.
So let's just welcome people back. In a few moments, we'll hear from a few people from different groups as we have each day. Yeah. And again, a few things to say as people are coming back. It's been really wonderful to hear the different organizations that are helping people at the bottom of the safety net. And so what we'll do at the end of the day is we'll share that list of organizations with all of you as well. What we found yesterday was really helpful is that people could raise their hand and then we can actually hear from you. And so it'd be great to start just with 3 voices from what you talked about or what came up in your small groups. Erica, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, I just really appreciated the international mix that we had of all women on this particular group. Many of us in that productive change zone, but noticing and watching how it fluctuated. I appreciated with the group that folks were sharing that really laughter and crying were ways that was moving energy. That gratitude really helped to expand the levels of tolerance at different points. I practiced that way. There was another really key point about noticing when feeling tired was a good indication that fear was really predominant, in the system. And that connection to something larger, that where I am in California right now, they've closed all the beaches and access to the ocean, which has been one of those things that's really rejuvenating to me. But like last night, just being able to be with the night sky and that incredible full moon was another way of getting that larger perspective that would allow for a little more capacity than what maybe my mind's ideas of what's happening and what's going on could be alleviated. So, thank you.
Of course. Let's hear from 2 others, just to get a flavor of what's present. Brittany, let's go to you.
Thank you. I'm happy to share back. And just want to say I was really grateful for the small group as we are operating in this space. I don't have childcare today, and so my baby was at one point screaming, and everyone was very, working through that with me and like, yeah, it's okay, get on, it's okay, you can start your video, you can talk now. It looks like he's quiet. So really, really appreciate that. And it seems like in our group before, we all were, talking about where we felt that we are on this diagram and our level of tolerance, but really sharing, and it seemed that there was a synergy that most of us were going through some type of transition. And so to be able to talk about, how our tolerance levels are in relation to that transition and what we're going through now was really, really helpful. And just sharing, we were all at a different place, but could relate, and then talk through some ways to kind of adjust, managing expectations, thinking about, instead of setting time constraints, more having a flow, ways to adjust around planning in this era that we're in. So really great.
Great. Can you share your baby's name before we move on?
His name is John, and he's actually, I think it's really, really rare these days. He's the 5th. My husband is the 4th, so he is John Gilmore the 5th.
Wow. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brandon, do you want to share next?
Sure. I think this is quick, but we were talking about if this might be a freezing coping mechanism, but wanting more time, wanting more time to understand ourselves or to adapt to this change. And for me personally, I related back to a fantasy or a wish that I think that I often have when my stress gets really high, which is that I could just stop the world for a moment. And it really made me think, I guess, be careful what you wish for. So in this moment when everything is frozen, there's a lot of responsibility and challenges that come with that. But on a positive note, I think also Andrea pointed out the ways in which the community is really, really coming back. I've been working remote for about 7 months, and it's. Sorry?
Someone else answered her phone, I think. Keep going, Brandon.
I've been working remote for 7 months, and I've been enjoying it, but it was very, very difficult always to get people to connect remotely, to turn on their cameras, to come to be in the same space with me when it was something I really, really needed. And now it's the easiest thing in the world. Look, there's 150 of us here, there were 400 yesterday. Everyone is showing an incredible willingness to connect and share, whether it's strangers or it's friends or it's family. And I think in a time where it's so easy to feel isolated, that's made me incredibly grateful. It's incredibly nice to find it with strangers as well as with friends.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing. Again, we're going to sort of shift this conversation, invite anyone who wants to stay on for the Q&A portion. Part of what we're trying to help think about is how do we create the space for each of us to do our adaptive work? In a way, we're always training each other of what it means and how we can show up. Part of doing and living in that space or living in these adaptive times is also exhausting. And what we talked about, I think on Monday a little bit, was that there's different kinds of exhaustion. There's exhaustion when you need sleep. There's exhaustion when you need peace. And there's also exhaustion when you need nourishment. And in some ways, I think all of those are still the right ingredients that we need in creating spaces for ourselves and each other to be in this kind of disequilibrium over time. So again, I want to say, allow anyone who sort of has pressing life and just needs their own space to jump off. Invite you to, we will send out a list of all the organizations where we can help and give time. Invite you to give us feedback of what of this is working or not so we can figure out how to continue. And again, tomorrow, we're going to do a deeper dive in how do you create safety and not the illusion of safety in some of this work and forms of self-protection. And then on Friday, we're going to do a much more specific process on how do you make the decisions that are in front of you and how do you dive into those. So let's continue now for those who want to stay, and please raise your hand and we will share questions, stories, or whatever is presenting to you in this zone of disequilibrium that we're kind of living through. So any questions or comments that people would like to start with?
Alexander.
Yes. Hello, Jeff. Good to see you, Jeff.
Thanks. In our group, we started talking about expectations. I wonder if you could riff for a few minutes about the relationship between the expectations we are choosing to respond to and the relative pressure that we feel that might move us up and down that chart a little bit.
So can you say a little bit more of some of the ingredients of your conversation, then I'm happy to respond.
Well, we were talking about, one of the people in our group was talking about stepping back and not trying to respond so quickly to other people's expectations. And another participant was talking about really being very good at helping other people with their stuff, not so good with her own, which rang really true with me. And so I just began to think about, and I didn't get to develop this at all, which is why I wanted you to riff on it so I could develop the thinking more, is just to what extent, does that choice we make about which expectations to pay attention to become less of a problem for us and more of an opportunity to manage the space, there's a change zone, as you call it, move up and to either lower the limit to raise the limit of tolerance, I could tolerate more, or comfort me more in that I'm on a journey here. I'm not going to get this. If we talked about the difference between trying to be right and be effective, is not always trying to get it right on the first try, which is a great way to keep anything from happening. And so I just began to think about it's sort of a product of our own making of which expectations that we experience from family, from coworkers, from bosses, from subordinates, do we choose to respond to or not? And how could we try to harness that to be more in control and less buffered about by the whole productive disequilibrium? Is that helpful?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Right?
I know.
And part of what I think you're asking about is how do we map what are the expectations and who are expectations are we trying to meet? And when we think about that map of expectations, we know that that map of expectations often has much less to do with us than we'd like to believe. That expectations is set up by the norms of society or the norms of our family or the norms of what success looks like in this organization or way of working. And we kind of walk into those norms very unconscious about our need to fit in and be liked or to do well. And so I think part of what you're talking about, Jeff, is how do you step back from those expectations and be more choosy about which ones of those you want to meet? which ones do you want to meet out of a need for safety? Part of the way we meet expectations is by keeping ourselves safe and hidden. So we do all these things so we're liked enough and our incompetence never gets exposed. And those are all the ways where we feel very busy about ourselves, but we're not actually living our own life or having more truthful, honest dynamics. So I think part of it is that set. Part of it is trying to think about, well, how did we learn to be this way? Where did we learn to show up in these kinds of ways? When I hear you talk about it and I get the emotion underneath me, to me, there's this fundamental dynamic of where does conditional and unconditional love show up? Which of us grew up in homes or workplaces where the conditions of being accepted mean that we had to leave some of it behind? And so what expectations did we learn to meet and what expectations did we learn to hide? And so that's a big part of this kind of choosing about what expectations we have to meet and what kind of honesty we have. But I think on the other side of part of that is we can do a really good job of kind of mapping those expectations and figuring out where they come from. But that's totally different from the craft of actually negotiating them. And the craft of how do you actually engage with groups and dynamics and reassert and assess what your needs are and how you engage with those. How do you say, here's why I'm here, here's what success looks, this is on the table, this is not. And so I think the craft is the other end of your question of how do you map those expectations, and then how do you have harder conversations or different conversations than you've had before. What's happening now is all of us are sort of sitting in very different ways with what our needs are, with not a bunch of experience of how to express them. And so I think a lot about the craft of how do we do that besides the just kind of expectation mapping. Mm. Jeff, you and I have had conversations before about how when someone walks into an organization and that first week they look around and they see how the place works and they're like, this place is crazy, right? And then 3 months later, they're used to it. Mm. And 3 years later, it's unconscious. And so all of us have been living in an unconscious curation of how we see the world, what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be part of the family. And it's very hard to say, I'm going to stand back from that, and the craft and skill to separate yourself. I think you're right that the exercise of mapping is very useful, but then the skill set to do something about it is the other piece that I think is underneath that.
Yeah.
Does that help a little bit?
That's really helpful. Yeah, the separating out the craft from the mapping is really useful.
Yeah. And again, you could think about it. What are my expectations from inside myself? What are the ones from my family of orange, from my social group, and from work and society? Like you could break it down in those 5 groups and actually say, yes, I'm affirming these, I'm denying these, and I'm going to experiment with these other ones.
Thank you.
Of course. Is there another question or another comment, another thing someone wants to share just about where they are, or a question they'd like to ask? We're all in disequilibrium together. Yeah. Who's that? Maybe raise your hand or.
John Bates.
Hi, John. Good to
Hi,
see you,
Zander.
John.
It's great to see you. Thanks for doing this. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've been thinking about that got reaffirmed for me in the small group that I keep reminding myself is that this is more difficult than it seems like it should be. And brave looks different than usual, right? Usually brave, like we're all brave people, we want to make a difference and we would run towards the battle. And now we're all stuck at home doing what feels the absolute opposite of courageous, which is holing up in our homes. And then I've been wondering why it's so difficult. I've got running water, I've got food, I've got my heater works, and I think to give myself and others grace around that. And I think the other big piece of this is just hard for our subconscious brains to process, our ancient brains, because it doesn't have teeth, it doesn't have fur, it's non-obvious, So it's taken me a while to get my head around why this is so difficult. And in the conversation that we had in the small rooms, that seemed to be kind of a theme. So just something I've been thinking about. I would love any of your comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're learning a lot about what does bravery look like and what is the territory that we need to explore. And I think I don't necessarily think it's true that we were brave out in the world, we were busy out in the world.
Yeah,
we were busy out in the world doing things that we got habituated doing And if we weren't brave in asking the assumptions or implications of those. And so now there's an invitation or a necessity to look inward and have bravery of that territory, right? About
Well said.
how are we living? How are we safe and secure? What are we doing in those spaces? And so, yes, part of what's being asked of us right now is a different form of bravery, but connecting it back to Jeff's question, it's actually, in my mind, a different form of competence. It's a different form of skill set to look at and examine what are the assumptions and how I live my life, what is sustainable, what is not. How do I examine what is the person I'm bringing into this relationship? You know, most of us loved being the technocrat of the way we knew how to live our life. And now some of that has been taken from us in a way that we now have to re-examine. And so bravery to me is obviously both kind of standing up for your beliefs and values, but it's also walking into unknown territory and being open to it. And part of why we showed the slide here is because there's the opportunity for bravery now. We want to match that with skill set, but there's also abundant ways that we can hide. And the sophistication with which we hide is just remarkable to me. It's some of our best skill set. And so part of what we can ask is, what are those methods and muscles that were built that we can go into other directions? I mean, I think it's really important to understand that the ways we've learned to survive trauma have two sides to them. They have the side where we learn how to be generative and understand and grow and build muscles. And then they also have the side of hiding. As someone who has experienced significant trauma in my own life, I can see so clearly, with hindsight only, the ways in which I avoided facing some of what needed to be faced. And so on the other side of this is some really fundamental questions of how do we live our life? What do we do for the planet? What do we do for each other? We're about to, in my opinion, move from extraordinary isolation into pods. The next step is going to be pods of us coming together with different norms of safety and rules. We agree to sort of cluster. That's a different level of engagement. Who's going to be protected in that? Who's going to be included or not? And what's the version of us that are going to show up? So I think there's both bravery in all of it. And I also want to honor that it has to be matched with skill and safety. Part of what we're going to spend tomorrow talking about is how do we keep ourselves safe, not the illusion of safety, as we walk into this territory. Thank you, John. Other questions, other ideas? It doesn't have to be for me. Other people can just share experiences. I'm happy to respond. I'm curious how this lands with people knowing that this state of disequilibrium might be longer than any of us wish. The other implication of this is that the way we were living our life was skirting on the surface of life and hiding some of the disequilibrium that was possible or we could have faced. If we were to spend some time looking at all the ways we were doing work avoidance of the adaptations we did or didn't make in the last year, that would be an interesting conversation. McKenna, you got a question you want to ask from yesterday. If you feel free, if we don't have a question for today, all we're trying to do is be of service. So feel free to ask from yesterday. Not everyone was here yesterday, so I might take a moment to explain, but go ahead, McKenna.
So yesterday, Alex, you walked us through scenario planning. And I found it to be a helpful tool, especially the earlier phases of it. I'm in the process of thinking through starting to develop a long range plan. And I'm wondering, how do those fit together? Like you talked about how, I forget if it was Shell, had a plan and they realized that didn't work. So do you recommend people do scenarios instead of plans, or do they work hand in hand together?
Oh, okay.
Guidance on that.
Yeah. So just to talk about, for those who didn't see yesterday, we spent and laid out a whole scenario planning method. For those who want to do that, we can send you the sort of the tape from that. Part of what scenario planning does is, rather than coming up with one strategic plan, it lays out multiple scenarios, and then you assess how prepared you are for each one of those scenarios, and what is the likelihood of them happening, and what's the decision tree that falls out of them. And so my big belief, given the increased volatility of the world, is it makes more sense to do that than just a signal plan process. In some ways, what the best strategic plan is, it's a result of having done that exercise and saying the way we think the world will most likely look is this scenario, and we're prepared for that in this way. But by the way, we have some contingencies. Like if it goes left, we've thought about how we can be a resilient organization. So what you may actually, I don't know what your job is asking you to do, and they might ask you to just present a plan, but a plan may be the result of that scenario exercise and talking about how not this is going to be the truth. This is our best guess under these assumptions with these values, and here's how we prepared for some resiliency, is smarter than saying this is exactly what we're doing and how we're going to spend our full budget. So I think that's where those two things intersect. And then connecting that to today's content, to what degree are you building a plan for a stable world where the majority of your work can happen in stability and status quo and calm? And to what degree are you building that plan to live in that disequilibrium? If you think about the organization that you're building of the future, what percentage of your staff should be in that gray zone that can operate what is known and what is, and what staff need to be operating that other space? What's the capacities we need to deliver on your plan, right? If you think about each of us, where are we capable of living in those spaces? So just to connect yesterday to today, that's how I begin to integrate some of those things. But my guess is, it's good to see you, Mac. But my guess is that all of us would love for somebody to come up with a plan right now and tell us what it is. Like there's something so satisfying in the myth and substance of that. Okay, sure. Lisa, do you want to sort of come in and jump in here?
Sure. And I'll show my face. So in the question, how do you help others expand their zone? Having shepherded change process in different scenarios, I know that different people come to change with their own sort of set of perspectives and what they're holding on to. And I wondered if you could elaborate on how you approach helping people expand their change zone, being responsive to where they are at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two answers to that. One is a softer one and one is a harder one. I think on the softer end, you obviously want to do the work to understand your audience or who you're partnering with. You want to understand what's on the table, what their risks, what their tolerance is. You want to understand in that sort of essential, expendable, emerging content we did on Monday, what's at risk for them, and engage them in that. So that's half of the answer. The other half of the answer, which is harder for people to contend with, is that you don't want to design it for everyone's lowest level of tolerance, and you may not be able to bring everyone with you. And so part of what the challenge is how do you hold people through a process of disequilibrium, not design it for the lowest threshold possible. And as you bring people through that change, there's gift and craft and skill in understanding what is at risk for them. Where could they go above that line or not? And begin to design and prepare safety mechanisms for that. For some of the people you're trying to bring along, just warning them, explaining to them what that journey is going to be like will be enough for them to live in that zone longer. For other people, you will realize the second category is they need something. They need a craft, they need a competency, they need a skill, they need a side conversation. So there's some people who, if you help and build their capacity, will be able to come along. And there's some who just won't. And I wish I could say everybody could come along and that would feel better, but in the truth, some of the urgency of what we have to do means that not everyone will come along. And so part of what you're asking for, I think the first part of it is quite diagnostic. How do I assess and understand where they are? Part of what's being revealed in this moment is a much more nuanced picture of what people's homes reality is. I never knew my colleagues what their house looked like, and we see it here. One of the great disappointments in universities, when it was harmonizing, everyone was kind of equal, and now they're doing Zoom calls and their poverty and privilege is being exposed. So we're learning so much about where they are, but I would try and treat it first as an investigative phase, and then I'd try to see who's in which of those three categories. Who, if they understand the process, can come along, who needs something in competency, skill, and who might struggle or who you could build some safety in. Does that help? Great.
Zander,
Anne?
we had
yeah,
a couple of questions from the chat from Esther and Isabel, so just want to give them an opportunity to ask to the group.
Okay, let's go to Anne and then we'll see what we can get through. Anne, should we go to your question with thought? Anne Gottlieb?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Good to see you, Anne.
Hi. First of all, I just wanted to remark on this collective learning that's happening just in the last 5 minutes. I mean, the whole call has been tremendous, and the small group really, I mean, I was late to the call, which was a cue to me that I was really angry this morning. And it came out of this level of frustration, you know, that things that I have no control over that are happening here in Wisconsin, where people I feel are endangered and standing in line to vote and having to make impossible choices. And then as I was on the small group call, I felt my heart open up, and my interest in love and care for what someone's doing in Nairobi, and someone who's trying to celebrate Passover in Istanbul, and someone who can't see the ocean in, you know, and it's an immediate change. And then John talking about bravery and you talking about expectation. I thought this is an immense amount of learning for me. And just that fact of it, just the awareness of having that, even at the same time that I am really struggling this morning, maybe not as much as I've struggled on other days, but I'm really struggling this morning. That I'm also at the same time concurrently really learning. And I feel as if that's the class that you're teaching today. I'm in a place of extreme disequilibrium, and that there's also quite a lot of openness for change. So I wanted to say that, and underneath all of that, another awareness that I wanted to share, and thank you for everyone, is that one awareness I have is how much I have this, and I suspect other people may have this as well, as the desire to know, to collect, to have a sense of concretizing, so I can have an inner sense in my body somatically of a certain kind of solidity. And I don't have that. And so when I don't have that, then a kind of numbing might want to set in. And that might, for me, come in the form of anger or pressure or intensity. And as I sit on the call, what I find is, as the disequilibrium happens and the openness happens, that underneath all of that is then a kind of innocence that I don't actually need to know. What I need is to learn. And that I'm not in charge of knowing, that the need to know comes out of my fear. That it's not only that I don't need to know, I'm not supposed to know. I don't actually have that kind of power. And that's truth. And as I say that, like, I'm actually trying to reconcile the fact that that is the truth. I am not omnipotent. Yeah. I know that sounds ridiculous, but really, I just wanted to fess up because I feel as if I'm not alone in that. So I just wanted to offer that and see if there's any response that, you know, that's all.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you saying that. And I appreciate that all of us have feelings that are coming up that might bounce us into that zone, feelings that we have dexterity with or not. And part of what I think often happens in crisis or an adaptive change is that we think there's a trade-off for substance for innocence, and that we're learning and we're growing, but we're giving up some of our innocence. And the challenge of how do we hold both of those inside of ourselves, inside of our families, inside of our businesses is actually really hard to do. And part of what we're trying to do here is when we face complexity and change, part of what I understand from you also is that we're trying to make sure that our cup is big enough or our bowl is big enough. When it's so complex and overwhelming, it means we don't have a big enough container for it. And so part of what we're trying to do in these sessions and part of what we're trying to do in the grounding is how do we have a big enough bowl for what's happening that can hold the fluctuations in feelings and energies, that can hold the trauma next to the excitement, but that also can hold substance of learning and growth and try and retain some innocence, because also what's happening is some real suffering. And so how do we find a big enough bowl, I think, is the challenge that is not just today's challenge, but it's the challenge moving forward. So Gabby, you've been waiting to ask something, so I'm going to turn to you next and try and get a few more in before I close today.
So my question is related to a little tying yesterday and today, especially around scenario planning. How do we do that while staying present? So I can see scenario planning for the business, but to me, when I see scenario planning, I equal that to doing. The time that we're living in now is pushing me to being and to living in the moment and to almost, the word enjoying is the wrong one, but you know, let me use that for now, enjoying the moment and going really deep on the emotions of the moment. And when I finished my session yesterday with you, I was highly anxious because I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to do all this planning and I don't even know how to start. So it kind of put me into motion again. So I was hoping you could reconcile those two, please.
Okay, sounds good. And also just to say, a bunch of people have asked us to do a much more substantive scenario planning workshop that can help walk people through that with the right pace and gentleness. So I just want to sort of put that out there and again, ask for your feedback of what you want us to do. Part of what you're talking about is a knowing, doing, being paradigm that everyone might not know, that there's different ways to exist. There's ways to exist as a doer, as a knower, thinker, and as being. And I just want to honor all three of those. I don't want to sort of promote being as the only way to go, but the quality of doing that comes from a more centered being is very real. It's impossible to do scenario planning all at once. It is a process of feeling and taking in data about what's happening to you, what's happening in the world around you, doing that sensing, doing that being, and from there designing scenarios, and then retouching with that and affirming that you're not coming from a fear-based or biased place. And so I think you're right to point out that it's a combination of being and doing, and that they're both necessary. Part of what happens with some of us have the luxury to step back as we spend a lot of time in being, and we need to do some stuff. We need to do some stuff to fix this broken world and to fix what's happening. But I think the grounded place and the origin where creativity and good information and perspective comes on to design those scenarios is really quite important. And if we come just from a doer, from a default of everything we've known, we're mostly going to replicate what happened previously. And so I think that's some of how I understand that. And again, I would just be listening inside of yourself, the part of you that's ready to act, or in the part of you that you'll know you're ready to act when you feel more grounded in your perspective, in your being. But to act too quickly is quite dangerous. And so we do think that the doing that happens from a quality of being is really important. And the rush to doing is replicating dinosaurs. Okay, we got a few minutes left. I think there are a few questions in the chat. I have very little ability to respond and be present and read the chat. So Rachel, if there's a question there you want me to respond to, I can do that. Otherwise, I'll try and respond to them directly by email. We're basically at our close of time though today. So I just want to say a few things. One, we really welcome your feedback of what you want and what you need for us. We're just trying to do our best to figure out how to create space and tools so we can metabolize what's happened. And so if you do take some time to help us think about what you want next, that would be wonderful. Second, tomorrow is a deeper dive on how do we actually keep ourselves safe on this journey and others safe versus kind of some of the illusions of safety. And so that's going to be an important conversation. And a friend, Jen Cohen, is going to join me for some of that because she's so expert in some of how we ground this as well. And then Friday is a very specific deep dive in decision making. And so for some of you who want to also get to some decisions, we're going to lay out a framework on Friday for that. Feel free to invite friends, colleagues, whoever you want to these sessions. They're designed to be helpful. We have so many good comments of organizations that we can help. We'll share that, everybody, with the list and video tonight as well. And thank you for just being present to each other. We appreciate you. So with that, we'll say goodbye for today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Sander.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, Zander. Thank you, everyone.
Lovely.
Very much.
Take care.
Scenario.
Love
Thank
and
you.
light.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bless you See you all. tomorrow.
Bless you.
Enjoy your day.
Good health to everyone.